I think we can start our presentation, and I'm proud to introduce our today's speaker, who is Michele, Espagne, famous researcher in cultural transfers between different countries, including Russia. And today we'll discuss the topic called what is a cultural transfer. I think that is the heart of your research, by the way, the key topic, the key issue. Usually the presentation lasts for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we start questions and answers session, followed by general discussion. And without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Professor Espagne. Welcome, please.
Thank you. So, I'm very grateful to Professor Krom for his invitation and his presentation. St. Petersburg is today more the right place for a Sunday than for a lecture, and in this atmosphere I will try to refer about the core of my research, the question of cultural transfers. I would like to deliver my paper in Russian, but English tolerates much better to be brutalized and mistreated than Russian, since it aims to be the language of the global village and denies the differences between the origins. What is a cultural transfer? In contemporary historiography, the representation of the identity in historical narratives is undermined by a lot of approaches ranging from comparativism to types of histories highlighting the phenomena of imbrication. It is rather on this dimension that the research on cultural transfer focuses. To better understand the differences and complementarity of the two approaches, we should, on the one hand, subject comparativism to a historical analysis of its premises and its developments, and on the other hand, consider the contribution of the research on cultural transfers to a particular object. I will particularly take here account of the transfer between the German and Russian spheres. I will also highlight the contribution of cultural transfers to post-colonial studies and the distance or points of convergence with historical comparativism. Few historians today are satisfied with the national framework. Attempts to enlarge it take different forms and follow diverse theoretical perspectives. Certainly, the political conjuncture of the European Union, for instance, plays a role. The human and social sciences are developing today under the cover and impulse of unspoken social expectations. The idea of making connections between distinct histories, or more precisely, of expanding the history of Europe to include other cultural zones, is very old. It seems to have a theological root that is expressed particularly in the 17th century with Bossuet's discourse on universal history. The core idea was to demonstrate the designs of providence in the development of well-known empires. But beyond this, the growing effort to attach the unknown to the known is evident in the supposition that recently discovered peoples might be the lost tribes of Israel. The history of pre-Columbian America, in particular, faced from the beginning the question of inclusion in the biblical framework. It was in order to connect the unknown to the known that China became the descendant of an Egyptian colony, a theory defended well into the 18th century by De Guigne, one of the first French sinologists. Integration of still little studied peoples into the historical field was inseparable from the determination of their exact place in the human family as set out in the Bible. History became a science with Scottish empiricism. One cannot overemphasize the importance of the works of Hume and of those that William Guthrie devoted to world history. Guthrie's text on world history became a work of reference in Europe, which the scholars of Göttingen, Christian Gottlob Heine, first among them, sought to bring into Germany by means of a translation. At the same time that the Göttingen historians translated Guthrie, they adapted and completed him, encouraging a local school of universal history beginning in the 1760s. This transposition corresponds to a translation often observed of Scottish empiricism in the context of the German Enlightenment. To write universal history, as did Schlosser or Gatterer among others, is to regard the chronicles of non-European people, China, India, or the Arab world, as having at least in part the same value as European sources. It is to think that these chronicles permit the reconstruction of parallel histories, even if an insufficiency of source material means that they remain partial. Historians bringing cultural zones together in this way are animated by two contradictory aims. On one hand, the goal is to reconstruct the developmental logic of heterogeneous peoples. On the other hand, there is still the idea of a unitary history that progressively integrates any new elements into itself. In practice, then, the countries outside the European core were included only when they were believed to have entered the system of history, and then a retrospective glance over the often obscure phases of their previous development was sufficient. To compare is already to resolve a fundamental contradiction between diachrony and synchrony. It's true that from the beginning, historians found alternatives to pure comparison. They sought, like Heeren, for example, to locate the paths between the different nations being studied and the points of articulation between peoples. Comparativism is in the narrowest sense of the term, which is based on the placing of objects side by side, is an epistemological attitude characteristic of the 19th century and one that is not to be found first in the domain of historiography. Plants were compared first in order to establish typologies, and then organisms in order to identify descent as much as genesis. Comparative anatomy, as the Baron Cuvier practiced it, disclosed lines of descent in the animal world and allowed the working of animals' bodies to be understood. The comparative grammar of Indo-European languages was favored both by the romantic search for origins and by the empirical discovery of a potential mother language, Sanskrit. This comparative grammar is founded by Franz Bopp and practiced by a number of mostly German linguists in the 19th century, constitutes a veritable archetype of comparison. Linguistic comparison is in principle free of any pretension to axiology. The compared objects refer simply to an original language, the famous Indo-European language. Later linguistic concretization are evaluated in terms of the distance that separates them from this reconstructed origin. One of the principal problems posed by linguistic comparison is that it has been transposed to nations and cultural zones speaking corresponding languages. This slide toward comparative anthropology can end in a hierarchy of peoples compared by language and arranged in terms of their proximity to supposed common origins. The comparison of languages has an Aranist legacy. Indeed, from the moment in which a mother language is reconstructed, it's only too easy to posit a corresponding ethnos defined through the exclusion of people not belonging to the same line of descent. Comparison became a yet more radical attitude, and philology developed into anthropology. Works like Fraser's The Golden Bough or Morgan's Ancient Society presuppose that texts or traditions are markers of social reality that must be posed in relation to one another in order to progressively construct a sort of grammar of human comportment and to discover the primitive building blocks of any social edifice. Comparison undertaken to this end brings together contemporary realities distant in space as well as cultural strata from distinct times. One can say that the history of anthropology up to Franz Boas, who represents in this regard a rupture, is strongly determined by comparative epistemology. Another element favorable to historical comparativism is no doubt the birth of Völkerpsychologie, psychology of ethnos, as elaborated successively by Heimann Steinthal and Wilhelm Wundt. The idea according to which the diverse linguistic, artistic, and economic manifestations of social life are expressions of a collective psyche distinguishing peoples or nations as individuals leads naturally to the confrontation, which is to say comparison of the building blocks of these collective psyches. These comparisons bring peoples up to the point without history into the historical universe and establishes temporal connections between moments that are chronologically far apart. A form of Kulturgeschichte oder Universalgeschichte is born, which recalls certain aspects of its 18th century predecessors, but rests this time on one of the major pillars of the nascent social sciences, psychology. We know that the German historian Karl Lamprecht recognizes in many places a depth to Wundtian psychology that leads him to attempt to integrate distant peoples into the same historical universe and above all, to take account of all the moments of collective psychology. Considered an extension of experimental psychology, Völkerpsychology favored comparison and served as a point of departure for ethnoanthropology or a new kind of universal history. The function of comparison can so much the less be underestimated in this situation because it constitutes a kind of pragmatic precondition for any extension of the field of perception. But for a long time, the parallelisms established by comparative social history or the enumeration of national treatments of such and such an archetypal motif in cultural history have been reproached for assuming a neutral observer who cannot exist and for separating the elements being compared from the dynamic of their own genesis and analyzing them as though they were invariant data. The semantic validity of the concepts used to define the objects being compared is itself hardly in question, even though these definitions are in no sense neutral and reflect the origin of the expectations of one of the two domains under comparison. The traditional notions of influence or diffusion are also not satisfying if one wishes to enlarge the national frame of cultural history, inasmuch as the terms themselves conserve an element of magic and bracket any question of mediation. To say that the French Revolution had an influence on German history is at base meaningless or manages only to reinforce the somewhat chauvinistic prejudice according to which the French Revolution played a central role in the history of Europe. When it's observed that an object or a school of thought has passed outside its national context, the first thing to do is to determine the ways in which it was exported. There is one case in particular in which historical comparativism shows its limits. This is the question of non-European history. One does not compare England and Burma or France and Vietnam. Few historians risk persisting in projects that juxtapose, at least in La Longue Durée, expansionist nationalisms to nations in the process of formation, often through the importation and reinterpretation of the very tools of colonization. On the one hand, one certainly can study the phenomena of importation and exportation, the reinterpretations to which they give rise, and the new developments demanded of the society concerned. But since nations are its principal objects, comparativism can hardly begin to treat the historiography of formerly colonized territories, which requires other methodologies. The ambition of global history is not limited to seeing to it that every region of the world enters into the historical space, since in order to achieve this, it must come to encompass every phenomenon of social life. It is for this reason that it is also a cultural history. But any movement of a cultural object from one context into another results in a transformation of its meaning, a dynamic of re-semanticization that we can fully recognize only by taking account of the historical vectors of the transfer. We can therefore say from the outset that research dealing with cultural transfers concerns most of the human sciences, even though its development involves a certain number of precise points of anchorage. To go beyond this minimalistic definition requires closing a certain number of false leads that the meaning of the term itself would seem to imply. To transfer is not to transport, but rather to metamorphose, and the term cannot by any means be reduced to the poorly circumscribed and very banal question of cultural exchanges. It is not so much a circulation of cultural goods as a reinterpretation that is in question. The notion of cultural transfer developed in the context of the study of 19th century Germany in its connections to France. The reference to Germany was then a structural element in the development of the human sciences, of the French human sciences. In order to approach this reference, it was necessary, on the one hand, to take into account the fact that objective knowledge concerning the German cultural domain was less important than the reorganization that it could be at the origin of, and on the other hand, that it was important to explore the transnational vectors. From this point, we found ourselves placed before research of a hermeneutic nature centered around the determination of new meanings and faced with a historical sociological type of inquiry concerning the vectors of transfer between the two countries. Research concerning transfers how to admit that the appropriation of a cultural object liberates itself from its model, which is to say that a transposition, however far removed from the original it may be, has just as much legitimacy as a model. As a result, the notion of comparison as an additional principle of openness to different spaces in the human and social sciences lost its relevance and had to be replaced by the observation of forms of cultural mixing and hybridization. The study of cultural transfers obliges us to diminish the relative importance of comparison. Indeed, this latter tends to confront entities in order to tally their resemblances and dissemblances, but barely takes into account the observer who is making the comparison, who is opposing in order to reassemble, projecting his own system of categories, creating reductive oppositions, and who himself generally belongs to one of the two terms of the comparison. Being grounded particularly in the comparative grammar of Indo-European languages, comparativism also inherits its limitations. Springing from the Franco-German context, this research rapidly enlarged its terrain of investigation to include other implications of national spaces and even made complex analysis of the interfaces between 3 or 4 cultural spaces. These investigations brought the role of diverse instances of mediation to the forefront. There are innumerable studies on travelers. Work on shopkeepers has been developed rapidly, while investigations had just begun on the military, artists, and translators. On the other hand, the history of the book has already happily explored the role of bookstores and publishers, and collectors have been treated through the history of museums. Above all, one must also emphasize the unavoidable semantic transformation associated with importation to a new context. Particular attention should be paid to the transformation that a cultural import brings about in the context of its reception, and inversely the positive effect of this reception context on the new meaning of the object. A translation has no less legitimacy or originality than its model. The problem of determining if an import is adequate or authentic loses by the same token all its pertinence. One notable consequence is the new evaluation of the role played by the series of foreign references characteristic of each national space. Each culture makes a foreign pantheon for itself that in no sense corresponds to the pantheon in the country of origin. The questions of semantic transformations connected to the transfer persist in the case of terms which sound similar in many languages and which may be considered equivalents, but which have a different significance in different contexts. This is the case for the whole vocabulary of the human and social sciences. One pretends as though the word philosophy or bourgeoisie have the same meaning in Germany and in France in the 19th century, only to be surprised at the translation of a German philosophical treatise into French, which is to say its insertion into a new context radically modifies its meaning. Reinhard Koselleck's Begriffsgeschichte or conceptual history is therefore potentially very useful, with the reservation only that this history must be transnational. Concepts do not have a genealogy exclusively connected to a single linguistic zone. Rather, their meaning is also the result of displacements that demand adaptation and linguistic enrichment that must be taken into account. The transferred object is defined in national terms in its original national context. Research on transfers has often been quite unjustly reproached for remaining grounded in nationally oriented arguments that it was supposed to escape. First, it must be emphasized that the context of departure may certainly be defined in national terms, but this may also be done through religious, dynastic, ethnic, linguistic, or even professional categories. In the 16th century or in the Middle Ages, religious and dynastic concerns were much more important than national ones. It is true that the human sciences were founded only in the middle of the 18th century at the same moment as the birth of the European nations. This is why, from an entirely pragmatic point of view, the national limits of the human sciences remain more important than their religious limits or their ethnic background. Work on national métissage has long since gone beyond the idea that there were at first purely ethnic or national substances which later gave way to métissage. All national constellations are the result of past hybridization, but it's nearly impossible to grasp the succession of cultural encounters without selecting stable moments and considering them as relatively coherent constellations. When we limit ourselves to approaching a cultural transfer between two cultural spaces, this does not in any way mean that we can consider each of them as homogeneous and original. Each one is itself the result of prior displacements. Each one corresponds to a history of successive hybridizations. This must be kept in mind when one sets out describing a Franco-German cultural transfer, for example. Neither Germany nor France are essences. Nevertheless, however questionable these entities may be, the necessity of description requires us for a fleeting moment to suppose the existence of a system that we shall call Germany or France, Hellenism or Latinity. Archaic transfers into societies upon which modern Europe's self-perception is founded have already served to legitimate putting its domination into question. Check Anta Diop's book on Black Egypt, Nation Nègre et Culture, Negro Nations and Cultures, reinforced by the hypothesis of Martin Bernard's Black Athena, essentially aimed at the beginning of decolonization to designate an archaic African heritage at the heart of European civilization. The question of cultural transfers can therefore include a part of post-colonial approaches. The term might nevertheless seem rather inadequate when a medievalist demonstrates the fact that the German mysticism embodied by Meister Eckhart borrowed the theory of the intellect from Averroes, and when Greek philosophy detour through Islamic thought has become a classic object of Greek studies, it is not a matter of post-colonialism, but rather of the circulation of conceptual systems that, in function of the host context, modify their meaning. The Platonic keys used by Garcilaso de la Vega to describe his original culture lead to a double projection, that of Platonic categories onto the Inca society and that of Incan example to reinforce the Platonic model. A recent investigative research on the cultural transfers focused on the presence of a reference to Germany or France in the Russian culture of the 19th and early 20th century. For the last 10-20 years, work has been undertaken in this area in collaboration with the Institute of World Literature, in particular with my colleague Ekaterina Dmitrieva and Russian colleagues that address increasingly Russian literary history, as well as artistic, philosophical, or even political one in terms of cultural transfers. Since the Middle Ages, a German Russia has existed. Its threshold at the foreigner's neighborhood in Moscow, Niemieckaja Svoboda. The German population has underground bigger over the centuries, starting with the colonies of the Volga, which were established at the time of Catherine the Great, to the Baltic aristocrats serving the Tsar and the German scientists, supporting the influence of the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. The Germany, outside the boundaries, but at the same time adapted to Russian context, in which it leaves its mark and is attached to the country of origin, is actually complemented by a more elitist French presence, less profound and limited to the circle of the upper class or the nobility. It resulted in a production of very extensive literature. As much as the playwright August von Kotzebue contributed to the German theater of St. Petersburg, the publisher Weitbrecht is part of the history of a city that in 1900 numbered no less than 55,000 German-speaking people. Conversely, the Russian writers of St. Petersburg, from Biely to Mandelstam, involved in their novels an image of Germany. From Friedrich Maximilian Klinger to Afanasy Fiet, there are innumerous examples of German and Russian writers whose works are analyzed in terms of cultural transfers, or could be analyzed in terms of cultural transfers. Russian students in Germany, or more precisely, the Russian followers of Neo-Kantianism of Marburg, led to studies on their acquisition of a kind of knowledge which is the origin of their career in Russia. The role played by the University of Göttingen in the training of German teachers who populated in the 19th century the first great Russian university is well known. The great exploration of Siberia since the 18th century were carried out by German travelers serving the Russian Empire. If the 19th century France was largely formed on the behalf of German imports, this phenomenon is even more striking for Russia and does not only concern the 19th century but also part of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. The German colonies within the Russian Empire are obviously a point of entry for cultural imports. Along the Volga were colonies of farmers settled from Swabia, and their allegiance to the German culture has persisted since the 18th century. Baltic territories dominated by Germany are part of the Russian Empire, and in Riga, Herder himself was conscious of having been a subject of the Tsar. This population was a resource pool of civil service or imperial army administrators, and the case of Maximilian Klinger, the Sturm und Drang poet, reminds us that one could at the same time be official of the court of St. Petersburg and a German writer. Another phenomenon is that of exile. It does not date from the Soviet period, even if from Bunin to Nabokov, an important part of the Russian language literature or written literature by writers initially of Russian mother tongue was originally written abroad. The 19th century was also a period of exile. In the 1830s and 1840s, Prince Mещерский wrote his collections of poems in French. We think of a Turgenev sharing his time between France and Germany. Of course, exile is at different levels. Sometimes the exile of Russian aristocrats in the 18th or 19th century was the opportunity to develop the literature of the host country at the same time as weaving a closer link with the Russian context. The Circle of Münster, founded by Princess Amalie Galitzin, and where the spiritualist philosopher Jacobi, or the poet Stolberg, and writer Matthias Claudius spent a lot of time, is one of the major sites of German literary sociability in the late 18th century. Similarly, the Parisian Salon of the Baltic Princess Juliane of Krüdener is a meeting place for representatives of the first French Romanticism. But if the Livonian is a French writer, she retains links with Russia. The Salon of Maria Pavlovna, wife of the Duke of Weimar at the time of Goethe, is obviously one of the sense of Russian classical German culture. Russian exile is found to be involved in the creation of European intellectual networks until the 20th century, when Kojevnikov, Gurvitch, Koyré pass on to the French public knowledge about German philosophy reconsidered under the angle of the Russian Orthodox thought. Representations that we can have of Russia's 18th century are due to official paintings. Portraits that have fixed forever the feature of the aristocracy as well as the salon's genre sense families. From 1747, Jakob Stelin becomes director of the Department of Fine Arts at the Academy of St. Petersburg. A colony of foreign artists had settled on the island of Vassilyevsky. Hamburg's portraitist Johann Balthasar Frankart, for example, painted the features of the Baroness Count Stroganov or the ones of Count Sheremetyev. Miss Markina, art historian, highlighted this phenomenon of German painters in post-Petrine St. Petersburg, in which they transmit the memory to posterity in a book on the painter Georg Groth. Originally from a family of painters from Württemberg, he lived in Russia since at least 1739 and worked as court painter, which does not prevent him from selling paintings and engravings. But it is especially the official portraits of the Empress and of her entourage which made his glory. There is a clear continuity between the portraits of the Württemberg aristocrats drawn before his departure for Russia and the portraits of the imperial court. One could speak of a projection, but in fact it is mostly a compromise between German painting that highlights elements within the bourgeois society, moments of family romance, and the splendor of the court of St. Petersburg. It is indeed a German construction of the Russian memory. A German construction of the Russian memory. Incidentally, this continues in the time. Thus, in the early 19th century, Gerhard von Kügelgen, professor at the Dresden Academy and for a long time court painter in St. Petersburg, painted at the same time portraits of the imperial family, especially of Alexander I, and portraits of the pantheon of German literature, including those of Goethe and Schiller. These examples suffice to show the existence of an entangled history that goes against national narratives and closely mingled Germany with Russia, the French-speaking space often appearing in the background as a third party. Certainly, one can always consider that there are distinct entities with multiple bridges which are useful to identify, but it is also conceivable to show osmotic situations such as multiple gradations. That which is a product of a cultural array also belongs to the other one. Therefore, we will not highlight as much the bridges, extend the number of examples observed, but highlight the shifts that occur, observe the forms of reinterpretation and adaptations to a welcoming context, which result in that Russian culture is built with important materials, or that German or French intellectual productions are inexplicable without a Russian background. Certainly, there are translations in the most fundamental re-semanticization is that of moving words from one language to those of another. But in the case of the German-Russian network, translation is almost secondary. Russian scientists or writers of the 19th century had an immediate relationship with the literature or with German philosophy and had no need of translation to own it. Moreover, throughout the 19th century, the publication journals of the Academy of Sciences of Russia gladly welcomed texts in German or French. It's probably in the study of imbrications related to the disciplines of humanities, those in which anchor the claims of identity, that we can best observe the phenomena of osmosis and the dynamics of cultural transfers. Without the need of translation, the most prominent representatives of the humanities in Russia, on literary history to art history and philology to anthropology, have always been readers of what Germany produced in the same field. They were also sometimes German or German-speaking or partly trained in German universities. In fact, what Russia retained from the impetus borrowed from German science is not always what German memory itself has preserved from the earlier stages of its own history. There are a lot of philosophers, theorists, historians who have lost all importance in their original German context, but found a new one in the Russian context, the function of which may be, from the perspective of the cultural history of Germany, to preserve traces of it. We thus find in the geological strata of the Russian cultural space the fossil strata of a forgotten Germany. If it is particularly necessary to concentrate on the history of knowledge, it is that the forms of identity construction are always located at this level. It takes a literary history and a historiography to constitute a nation. These tools used to build an identity always have a tendency to suppress and conceal the imported materials by reinterpreting them from one context to another. The choice of subjects made from this demonstration is partly random. We cannot follow all the humanities, but maybe some of them are more likely than others to illustrate the transition eras. German philosophy was a central reference in the philosophical history of Russia from the period when the disputes between Westernizers and Slavophiles took place on the background of an appropriation of Hegel and Schelling through attempt to stem the Kantianism through Bergson until the discovery of Husserl's phenomenology by Gustav Speth. While psychology is a dominant human science in Germany in the last third of the 19th century, Russia has not escaped this influence. But we can also observe a strong presence in the Russian sphere of references to German philology or to a history of art that grows better than elsewhere in German-speaking countries. The transition from one cultural sphere to another can moreover lead to the transition from one discipline to another. Mediations, which allow the passages of elements of a scientific culture to another, are diverse in nature. Minorities living on one side or another of the border are, with travelers, the most obvious sociological mediation. And then there are, of course, the universities. In this regard, we must especially take a look at Dorpat, Yuriev, Tartu, a German language university, but under the direct authority of German officials of the Court at St. Petersburg. To be more precise, the founder of Dorpat, Parot, was a Germanized French from the enclave of Württemberg in France, Montbéliard, Mumpelgard. Dorpat was a Russian university of German language until the 80th of the 19th century. It was renamed then Yuriev. More generally, we can say that the Baltic territories, home for German subjects of the Russian Empire, represented a bridge between the two cultures, while at the same time were a sort of resource pool of administrative officials dedicated to the empire. But there are also areas of German-Russian mediation in Germany. We primarily think of the University of Göttingen. It was a sort of reservoir from which Sergei Uvarov, long in charge of higher education in Russia, was getting new teachers from. Schlözer also came from Göttingen, which, through the Chronicle of Nestor, was one of the first historians of the Russian Middle Age, and it is also to Göttingen that he returned after a long stay in Russia. The first Russian students came to Leipzig in the 18th century, including Radishchev, the famous author of the journey from Moscow to Petersburg. One could also consider the University of Marburg to the extent that this high place of German neo-Kantianism was also a training venue for several generations of Russian philosophers. Pasternak, for instance. Later on, as with Alexander von Humboldt, Lomonosov was trained at the Freiburg University of Mining and Technology. We have to think about the details. Alexander von Humboldt and Lomonosov were students of this Freiburg University of Mining and Technology in Germany. The observation of transfers between Germany and Russia helps us to update the geography of the meeting points. The German-Russian sphere seems to shrink to areas of extreme imbrication where the transfer mainly occur. The exploration of German-Russian cultural transfers in the field of the history of the knowledge should incorporate the issue of language. In the Russian sphere, even the Russian scientific language was in competition with German or French until the mid-19th century. It is common to find in the scientific journals, such as the ones of the Annals of the Academy of Science in St. Petersburg, articles in French or German, whose authors are often teachers from Western Europe and who continue to conduct their scientific life in their native language. Let us look now at a passionate historian of the German and Russian national antiquities, Friedrich Braun. Friedrich Fyodor Alexandrovich Braun, born in 1862 in St. Petersburg. He studied Germanic philology there from 1880 to 1885 before becoming a high school teacher and then private docent and professor. He had to leave Russia at the time of the First World War and settle in Leipzig. Later, in 1920, the Soviet Commissariat for Education commissioned him to put together a large bibliography of all German scientific work published since 1940. Becoming professor of Germanics in Leipzig in 1922, he remained a Russian language assistant. In 1926, he was co-director of the Leipzig Institute for Research on Eastern Europe. He is credited in the 20s with a German translation of Russian historical works like the story of Klushevsky, of whom he had been directly a pupil. He co-edited with Maxim Gorky a journal of the First Immigration, which was published from 1922 to 1923 under the name of Besieda. Although he was appointed in 1926 as a corresponding member of the Academy of Sciences, he did not return to Russia, but his title earned him some trouble during the Nazi era. He died in 1942. Dean of the Petersburg Faculty of Arts and president of the Philologists Circle, this little-known figure of German studies at the heart of the Russian humanities after the Veselovsky generation deserves particular attention to the extent that he too was a medievalist. His area of personal investigation was a question of relations between the Goths and the Slavs. He investigated the amazing traces that constitute up to the 17th century the Goths of the Crimea. In the footsteps of their migration, their language, and their absorption by the Tatar ethnic background. More broadly, he was interested in Germanic influences on the legends of ancient Russia, but also in the history of German Romanticism. Braun is certainly one of these responsible for a shift in the Russian scientific curiosity around 1900 to the question of German medieval culture. Under his students was, for instance, the member of the formalist school, Germunsky. A field of Russian history that deserves to be addressed, especially in terms of cultural transfer, is that of Russian Orientalism. On the one hand, the extension to Central Asia, since the capture of Kazan, is one of the fundamental elements of Russian history, and it is precisely in Kazan that developed since the early 19th century Russian science of the East. It involved learning Tatar and other Asian languages. Russian Orientalism was then developed in St. Petersburg with a conviction to understand the Eastern cultures integrated into the empire, but also with the idea of developing a new form of humanism in which knowledge of Greek antiquity would marry with the knowledge of the East, where one would look for, such as in Persian texts, traces of lost Greek works. But what is striking in this long history of Russian Orientalism, which includes a reference to Central Asia in Russian humanities, and will only be reinforced during the time when a part of Russian intellectuals will be moved to Tashkent in the 40s, is that it is largely due to the immigration of French or German scholars, taking, for example, Christian Martin Frehn from Rostock, who taught Oriental languages at Kazan before moving to St. Petersburg, through to Alexander von Stahl-Holstein, who began his career as a sinologist in St. Petersburg before he finished his career as a sinologist in Beijing. Russian Orientalism is largely a matter of foreign scholars, especially Germans. And now a few words about perspectives and future of research on cultural transfers. After an overview of the examples provided by the German-Russian history, one may wonder what new perspectives and contributions related to the methodology of cultural transfers are. The first point relates to the detection of a very heterogeneous structure of the memory that doesn't reflect any archival order, very oriented toward highlighting nationalism. One assumes more or less that any country develops itself on the basis of internal dynamics. Saxony, as a core of a future German identity, appropriates such foreign cultural objects whose link with a foreign country is gradually repressed in German history. Who will remember that in the 18th century, Polish and Ukrainian and Jewish merchants had made the fortune of Leipzig, of the main fair in Germany. In the dynamic of ownership of something foreign, isolated social groups can play a prominent role disproportionate to their demographic weight. For comparativism, which confronts these historical phenomena, these groups who fully deserve historical analysis play no role. Research on cultural transfers is further able to analyze the transformations that the receiving context housed to foreign exportations. For example, the Leipzig Fair has no actual existence independently from the Polish Jews and Greek traders' seasonal immigration. The reception of Russian music in France in the late 19th century profoundly modified the Parisian musical context by offering an alternative to the dominance of German music. The German merchants who ran the export of Bordeaux wines in the 18th and 19th century changed the face of the city of the French province, although they were mainly interested in their own business. The difference between the original context and the host, which does not have much sense in a historical comparativist context, is crucial to address the cultural transfer, showing the imbrication of two cultural systems. From this point of view, Saxony is a piece of Poland or France, and the import of any cultural property corresponds to a transformation of the characteristics of the receiving culture. A second contribution to the research on cultural transfer seems to rest on the fact that the distribution of European space is transformed because of them. The link between the regions draws new ideas and detaches the regions from the various national frameworks to the point of making a historiography possible that is no more ethnocentric. A new form of transnational historiography could be based on not considering the specific territories as comparable units, but as interweaving parts of a puzzle. Besides the artificially constructed national or territorial identities, there would be in fact a seminal foreignness to introduce into historical consciousness. Precisely in the case of the historical perception of regions with low population, this mode of approach avoids relegation in peripheral positions. Generally, the opposition between a center and a periphery is irrelevant in the research of cultural transfers. This is because many Scandinavians ensured an important mediation between France and Germany, that their story deserves as much attention as the European center. Russia is just as central in Europe as France or Germany, because one would not conceive, for example, the French intellectual history of the last 100 years without a structural link with Russia, from Russian novels to the history of science, passing through the aesthetics of the early 20th century. What is very characteristic here is the history of the relationships with Greece, of Philhellenism in European countries from the 19th to the 20th century. On one side, we deal with a common denominator where the political position of the countries crystallizes. Despite the diversity of viewpoints, it's a common aspiration towards asserting cosmopolitanism. Even though the Greek reference in the construction of Berlin as a German capital during the 19th century was central, we think, for example, of the island of museum, the Museumsinsel in the heart of Berlin. We will particularly remember the case of Munich among the most striking manifestations of German Hellenism in the 19th century. Munich, often referred to as the Athens of the Isar, combines a prominent role in the political Philhellenism, asserts more than other regions the German presence in Greece, but also helps to show the ambiguity of the Greek reference. We have to remember that it is King Ludwig I, initially a liberal ruler, who became increasingly despotic, that triggers the Bavarian Philhellenic movement, and it is in Munich that the Greek decors reach a stage of inauthenticity which contributed to the emergence of the kitsch concept. The Greek periphery is at the center of Germany, at the center of Munich, at the center of Berlin. It's clear that an applied research of this phenomena of imbrication and of the reinterpretation linked to imbrication is likely to exceed the national history of humanities and open a wide field of investigation which could be the form to come of the cultural history of Europe. If there is no need to stress here that Russia is a central part of Europe, very precisely of the German or French cultural history, and conversely Europe is part of Russia, the systematic history of the imbrications still largely needs to be written. Russia is only one case among others, and it is the ensemble of cultural areas forming the European space that could now be examined in this way. There is certainly no question in denying strong identity. Spain is not Germany, but to show how far they are built with one another. A few words for conclusion. Comparativism deserves to be restored in a diachronically study of transnational historiography, including research on cultural transfers. The first attempt to broaden the history of Western Europe to the Eastern Territory or peripheries already involved integrating annals or written records of these outer regions within a framework that hitherto did not take them into account. They were thereby reinterpreted. Cultural transfers replace all the comparisons in overview representations by a research of procedures of re-semantisation of historical objects and by the vectors of these re-semantizations. The question of German-Russian cultural transfer during the whole of the 19th century is a particularly rich field to approach for the research of cultural transfers. It particularly allows the overcoming of the problems of center and periphery that comparativism in the narrowest sense of the word has difficulty solving. It's true that the very term comparativism covers various types of historiography, and as soon as it incorporates a history of relations, in German Beziehungsgeschichte, it takes into account the phenomena of semantic displacement, confronts itself to shared or entangled history. Comparativism converges strongly with research on cultural transfers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Now, please, your questions. I think you can ask questions in any language you like, in English, in French, in German, in Russian. We can translate it into French or into English, so please feel free to ask questions. Welcome. Well, I encourage you to ask questions, please. Who is brave enough? Alexandra, will you start?
May I ask maybe about the recent developments of the studies of transfers? I mean, it began a long time ago, yeah? It's 80s, yeah, or the beginning of the 90s, yeah?
So the first papers were published 1985.
Mm-hmm.
85, yeah, it's 80s, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So it's long road, yeah,
It's a long road.
development, how the plant is developing. And I'm very much curious about what is going on now, yeah? What is going on, yeah?
You know, for the first time, the research about cultural transfer developed in the circle of philologists we were concerned with history of German and French literature of the 19th century. And then we discovered that to understand the place of German culture in the French literature or of French culture in the German literature, it was necessary to go to an historical point of view, and it was necessary to face questions of book history, for instance. And we had a development in this direction. And then it was strange to consider the German-French relations as a special point of view. We had to enlarge the perspective and to try to involve, for instance, another neighborhood of Germany in our research, and that was the Russian literature or the history of Russian culture. And at every stage of this development, we saw the possibility to understand cultural transfer as a sort of historiographical model that could be used for every area in the world. Particularly, it seems to be useful when we have to observe the relations between France and former colonies, between Europe and former colonies. It seems to be also very useful to criticize the representation of a center in cultural history and of periphery. We have often criticized the difference between center and periphery. And I think it gives a possibility to understand, for instance, the history of the Scandinavian world as a center of Europe history. Cultural transfer gives an opportunity to displace the center, or to see that every point of the periphery may be considered as a center too.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I have two questions. One is about, I come from the history of technology, and I'm sort of interested in, of course you also have gone developments around transnational history and all that, but I'm actually interested in whether you think that these concepts that have been developed around cultural transfer can be used in other context than nationality and people. So, for example, within science, we talk about transfer between, for example, scientists and media or culture or different sort of forums or different places where there are different cultures of how to act things or how to perceive things. And when you think that your sort of methods or concepts could be used, for example, in that regard, is one question. And the second question is, you were just talking now about center and periphery and all of these things and the colonies. And could you develop a little bit more specifically how different cultural transfers deals with issues of power relationships, or hierarchies, and how to sort of deal with that when you deal with the issue of cultural transfers?
And on the first point, I think the methodology of cultural transfer research may be useful to understand at first the history of social and human sciences, including ethnology. And I want to stress the word ethnology because it was an example for us to look at the history of American ethnology, American anthropology. The most important figure at the beginning of the American anthropology is a German Jew, Franz Boas. And Franz Boas was educated in Germany. And in Germany, he may be considered as a heir of the romanticism of the brother Grimms. And he collected, for instance, legends and popular histories, and he transferred this model to the research on the Indian populations in America, and did research about Indian populations in America, with this German philological background is at the basis of the American anthropology. So you can see that the opportunity of using cultural transfer models in the analysis of human and social sciences, and especially in the history of ethnology. The students of Boas were immigrants from Central Europe, Jewish German immigrants from Central Europe, who were the heirs of the discourse about philology, about psychology at the European universities where they were students. Your second point is the question of power in cultural transfer. It is indeed a great problem. When you try, for instance, to understand the cultural transfer between Cameroon and Germany, you have on one side a colony, on the other side the colonization, the history of colonization. But you can observe that the influence is not only on one direction. That is to say, the habit of consumption, for instance, were völlig. I begin German.
Mixing German.
Well, the habit of conceptions were others in Germany because of the import of African products. And not only products were imported, but also aesthetics forms. The culture of painting masks, for instance, was very important in the history of Cubism. And it's possible to show that the dimension of power between Cameroon and Hamburg or Germany in general was very important, but there was an influence of Africa onto Germany. And I think the model of cultural transfer is very useful to understand such relations. The same for the relations between France and Vietnam. Vietnam was a colony of France, but a lot of French writers were children spent their childhood in Vietnam, and they were though marked by the atmosphere of Vietnam, that Vietnam belongs to the representation of French world. And the first philosopher who imported the German phenomenology of Husserl into France was a Vietnamese student in France, and he thought it was very important. And he played the role of a mediator between Germany and France as a Vietnamese philosopher, you see. And we have just to look at such phenomena and consider them as more important as traditionally models of power and submission or such things.
Can understand it, because I think it's also, I think that's a great sort of way of seeing them both ways. With, at the same time as there's always, I'm missing always a cultural transfer. You can have different amounts of power or amounts of money or something that lies behind the cultural transfer. Like some happen just because people travel, and other happen because someone with power or money wants a transfer to happen, so they impose a transfer. Just to make a difference, I guess, on these different, or how they work.
Of course.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, please, Sam.
Can I ask about the institutional challenges that you have faced in a French context? Because you began your talk talking about the fact that many historians are frustrated or recognize the limitations of national narratives. And this seems to me apt and true, but particularly at university level. And certainly in the department here, at European University of St. Petersburg, all of our history faculty, while they recognize the need and the usefulness of a transnational approach or culture, taking into account cultural transfers, we face a publication environment, and we inherit students who've been trained in traditions in which history is still very much imagined in national terms. Can I ask, in France, whether or not you see the institutional climate changing to converge with sort of the supra or transnational changes that are happening at the university level?
I see an evolution in France from the national historiography to a transnational historiography, but we are not at the beginning of this evolution. We can look at a few. I think this evolution may be observed since 20 or 25 years. A problem with transnational historiography results in the difficulty of knowing enough languages to have a really possible research field. I think transnational historiography can a global historiography, but global historiography is in danger to be the world history from the point of view of American university of our times. If you want to avoid this narrowed point of view, you have to know a lot of tradition and of languages, and it's of course very difficult. So I think historiography, transfer historiography try to focus on little constellations who can be clearly overused, and that's perhaps not so much to do with global history. Or we try to correct global history while we are stressing special phenomena. Because I think it's the danger of global history that it cannot consider the problem of center and periphery with enough attention, and it considers that there is a sort of a center for historiography, and this center of historiography that is the universities of North America and of Western Europe. And we have to face this point of view and to criticize this point of view if we want to have really a global history or a transnational history. And I think transfer questions, transfer models may be very useful for the comprehension of this phenomenon.
Thank you. Okay, yes, Olga?
Thank you for the presentation. And I have a question about the level of comparison, because you told that nations is an obsolete term, and in your speech you have repeatedly used the term cultural zones, and also you told that there is no France per se, or there is no Germany, because there are different cultural and different territories, different cultural zones. And in my research, I have a problem because I'm working on transfers in the field of architecture between the USSR and I can't say between the USSR and what there, because it's the problem of transfer of modernist architecture, and I use the term Western architecture. And for example, Michele, Professor Krom often pointed out that there is no West. It's a conventional term. You should be more precise. But the problem is that modernist architecture was international architecture. So it was very similar in the US and in France and in Germany. And so here I have a really a huge problem on this level of comparison, because when I'm speaking about reception in the USSR, in many cases it was not the case of French or German. It was not the case of national architecture, but it was the case of a very wide notion of Western architecture, so foreign architecture. So maybe
Yeah, I think you are right. You can observe, for instance, that at the front of the Louvre Museum in Paris, we have a sort of architecture which has been built by a Chinese architect, and you know the great opera in Beijing has been made by a French architect. And it's difficult to say that the Louvre looks Chinese or that the opera in Beijing looks French. But it concerns only the modern architecture of the last years. I think if you look at the model of architecture in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century, or at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, and you look at the former German embassy in St. Petersburg, you can see that the German model, especially German model, is present in the center of the Russian capital of the time, and you can in the middle of the 20th century. You can observe how modern form of Russian architecture had been transported, for instance, to the capital of Poland. You have the same big tower than in Moscow that had been built in the center of Warsaw, you have a lot of architects from German origin. We have worked in Warsaw, and then have been had an influence of the new architecture of Moscow. I think to say that the national models have disappeared is possibly for the last years, but I think it cannot be the case for the architecture in the middle of the 20th century, and we aim to say nationalism is a thing of the 19th century. But if we look at the newspapers nowadays,
it is still there.
I think it's not so easy to tell nationalism disappeared.
Well, I know very well the work of Olga, of course, because I'm supervisor, actually, or advisor. And the problem really is how to call this sort of transfer, because Olga studies or pictures just a piece of this transfer, an exhibition of American architecture here in Leningrad and in Moscow and some other places in the mid-60s. And these American architects, they, for instance, mentioned Le Corbusier as their own, of course, architect, typical probably for the US architecture. And so it was a mixture of names from different places, international actually. But interesting that in these discussions, they opposed European, including the Soviet Union, European style of architecture and American one, if I'm not mistaken. So there was a sort of opposition. And besides, you mentioned center and periphery. And the so-called West is, of course, as perceived from the Soviet Union. So through these Iron Curtain, the problem of Iron Curtains, when we pronounce West, it means beyond the boundary, so somewhere there. And we are sitting here like in a cave, so closed within, and there is, well, an outer world. So it's a very ideological and very complicated issue, actually. And it's present everywhere, including architecture and other arts. Well, any more questions, please?
You know, the model of Kathleen, for instance, had a great reception in France all the times. And it was perceived as a model from the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What, please? Questions, comments, welcome. Discussion, we can just start a discussion.
Critics.
Critics, welcome. Yeah, Alexandra?
One question more.
Mm-hmm.
It is about details, about how cultural transfer is going on, and how it's organized, and who are the actors of that cultural transfer, and the objects. What is transferred? It's only ideas, or models, or something else. Maybe objects, instruments, maps, practices. Yeah. Maybe some different kind of objects. Yeah. Maybe a little bit more you can talk about your vision of that.
I think.
How it's developing, from the beginning and up to now, and maybe some of your visions how it will be next.
I think cultural transfer is nowadays a methodology, but this methodology has an application in many disciplines and many fields. And I observed, for instance, that in last time archaeologists are very interested in this model of cultural transfer because it brings a new light in the history of the Mediterranean world, which cannot be considered just as a Greek and Latin word, but at the word who Greeks and Latin people had to face people from Central Asia, from Anatolia, which had a great level of cultural achievement and who have been forgotten by the official history. And for archaeologists, it's a new perspective on the Greek history, for instance, to consider as a perspective of cultural transfer. And on another discipline is the history of art. The history of art is broadly considered as a history of a special country. It belongs to the tools which have been used for building a national identity. But nowadays, art history in France focuses more on the imports in the construction of art history, or in the historiography of art itself. Historiography of art develops at first in Germany and then was imported to France. And, history of art itself is a phenomenon of cultural transfer. We join once more the history of human and social sciences. But I know young art historians who try to examine the presence of Asiatic objects in the paintings of the 17th century. That is a topic for art historians, for instance. So you see the field of this type of research is very broad, and I try to explain how it developed from the German, French philology.
Okay. Questions? Comments? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to ask about the interrelation between the investigation of cultural transfers and the tradition of conceptual history, Kriegsgeschichte. Since, as I understand, Kriegsgeschichte is more concerned with the development of the word within one national context, one national country. So how do they work together? How do they conflate?
I admire the work of Koselleck very much. I find Begriffsgeschichte is very interesting and brought very much to the historiography. But I think I have a problem with Begriffsgeschichte because it considers just the German meaning of historian concepts. And you see, there is a lot of concepts which take place in the French tradition, the Spanish tradition, whatsoever, and doesn't belong to the origins of Koselleck. And I think it would be necessary to enlarge the perspective to a transnational historiography of the core concepts of history, historiography.
Well, we should be fair to Koselleck because he proposes not only a semasiological approach but onomasiological as well, which is especially important for, so to say, periphery, like Russia, I mean periphery of Europe, without Latin traditions, and using different words to figure out some important ideas. And I think that Koselleckian methodology is quite applicable to, and I'm trying to do it actually, using, well, different etymological roots, but nevertheless very similar in their career and their destiny to some West European concepts. So I think it's really fruitful, this methodology, in, well, doing transnational concept history or conceptual history. Well, some other questions, comments? Well, I'll probably seize the floor, the opportunity, and to start a sort of discussion, and some critique will be in order, I think. And then anybody who wants can just continue this debate. I feel a little bit uneasy with your first part. So the first part of your presentation, with this severe attack against comparison. Now I'm writing a student's book on comparison, and so of course I'm very much interested in this matter. If you are right, it's just an obsolete technique or obsolete attitude redolent of the 19th century, and then we should just abandon this practice of comparing, and so go for transfer culturel. Yeah. So I just make some points, and then you, of course, you can answer me because I see some points that can be criticized in your presentation. I mean, this critique of comparison. You start with this narrow sense of comparison, which probably goes back to 19th century scholarship of science. And of course, I must admit that some of your criticism criticisms really are well-founded. But in my view, it's only some uses, some forms of comparison, because we all know that we use comparison in our everyday life. It's just part of human condition, and it goes back to, well, Herodotus probably, who was a comparativist, so to say, both historian and ethnologist. He compared, for instance, Egypt and Greece, and also barbarians, these Persian army, Persian Tsar, and all that. So I think that we simply cannot do history or any other field without comparison. And the question is how to do it properly or to do it better. I think that comparison does not necessarily stick to national state or national entities. And let me remind you, Marc Bloch, his famous paper towards comparative history of European societies, where he formulated the precondition of any comparison. I would say it's minimal. What actually we need is just difference of social milieus. It's excellent, excellent. And as you see, it has nothing to do with nations or national state, because milieu, it can be just one building. It doesn't matter actually. We can compare not countries, not states, not something else, not objects, but we can study some process, some phenomenon probably, because cultural transfers is just a phenomenon, or in plural, phenomena, which proceed in different cultural and social milieus. So just going in the steps of Marc Bloch, we can see that it really works. So we do compare, but not necessarily with some link to the state or to nations and national states and all that. And on the other hand, I just noticed that in your presentation you could not do without these obsolete nations, because every minute you just mentioned Russia or Germany or France in different combinations, and that was well founded, well grounded, because in the 19th century it really mattered, these boundaries, these national boundaries. By the way, wonderfully described by Alexander Herzen, Russian writer, who just crossed as an exile. Yeah? He crossed the boundary from one empire into another one, actually into German world. Yeah? So I am finishing my critical remark at this point, but my point is that comparison is, so to say, eternal. We cannot do that, but we can choose, we can elaborate forms and do it better. And I would insist that comparison is present within your domain of transfer culturel. So please,
yes,
you can answer.
You are right, of course, and I agree with your critics. But I think I didn't tell anything else. Comparison is the basis of every scientific knowledge. Mm-hmm. We can do nothing as scholars without a comparison, without a series of phenomena. It's the basis of every scientific research. but on the other hand, it may be the tendency to construct objects which are then parallelized and without regarding the observer of the parallelized objects. And the most parallelized objects in historiography are the national objects. I know that I use the words France or Russia or Germany during my presentation, but at every time I try to use the word and to deny the meaning of the word. It's national transfer is a tendency to destroy the words which implies constructions of identities. But it's impossible to destroy these constructions without using the words itself. You know, the historians faced at every time the problems of semantic contents. For historians, for instance, who try to play with the word bourgeoisie, you can play with these words and deny that this word is consistent, but if you do that, you need to use the word itself. It's a sort of difficult by speaking. And our research about conference about cultural transfer began with the critique of comparativism, but we thought not especially about historian comparativism, but comparativism in literature, where you have such research projects which parallelized a motif like love or despair in many literatures without questioning the relations between these literatures, you know. Seduction in French, German, English Romanticism is not a topic which can be seriously considered. And it was our point at first. But I think that the development of historiography of comparativism had to take better in account the question of entanglement between the objects which are compared. And there is in Germany nowadays a school of comparativism, of social comparativism, which doesn't reflect about the observer at first. And if you write a book comparing two societies, you compare in most cases your own societies with the others without reflecting of the problems you have to project yourself in the comparison. So I think the question of entanglement and of relation of importation and exportation, of transformation of the sense through the importation and exportation as to be more reflected in the comparative history.
Let me remind you one famous example. And this is again Mark Bloch, who is my favorite historian, not only mine, of course. I mean, of course, his great book on Le Roi Thaumaturg, that is the king's healers. And I think it's an example of entangled histories, or histoire croisée, or whatever you call it. And of course, it's also about transfers, because Bloch supposed that the English, they borrowed the idea of healing scrofula from Capetines, so from the French court, they borrowed it and then developed their own ritual or their own king's royal right. Of course, he never used the terms like we today, like histoire croisée, like transfers and all that. But in practice, he showed an example of doing such things. And what it's about the novelty of these approaches, a sort of avant lettre, as always with Marc Bloch, or very often. But another thing, this is about Galton's problem, the so-called Galton's problem, because what is so essential even for ethnologists or for natural scientists is not that much important for historians who have always compared connected histories, neighbors and all that, like Marc Bloch and many others. And they did not admit any specific methodological problem. Probably they should, but they did not see an obstacle that they should be isolated in a pure style like in chemistry or whatever. Of course, in history we almost, in every case, we see these connectedness, these influences and all that. That's normal. But how we can just study, for instance, Peter the Great and his reforms, we know that he borrowed a lot of things from his neighbors, like Sweden, like Germany, like other countries, and of course modified and changed also a lot. And this has been studied probably for centuries, but for many decades, and of course scholars are very, very well aware about connectedness, about these borrowings, transfers. So what I want to stress that it's not a novel thing, and that of course there is connectedness, but it doesn't prevent us from comparing. That's my point. And as always, we have bad examples and good examples, and we follow good ones and neglect some mistakes and misfortunes which occur in our scholarship as well. So that's my point.
But you know, I didn't even think that cultural transfer research could be an absolute discovery. You are right. There is no discovery in human sciences at all. But I think it could have been time to stress any points of view that could have been neglected. And you are right with your reference to Marc Bloch. But the paper of Marc Bloch, which is published 1928, has been widely forgotten. I think it's perhaps necessary to renew some principles which are affirmed in the paper. You are right. Connectedness had never been forgotten, and the question of borrowing is a classical question in historiography. But I think that this question of borrowing is not really considered as it ought to be, because it plays in many cases with the category of influence. And cultural transfer research try to face this category of influence from a critical point of view, and is very interested in the very difficult questions of solve the vectors by borrowing. I think it's not very necessary to understand cultural transfer research and comparativism as a competition, also war between two positions, but you can of course converge. It's a question of points which are more or less stretched in one position or in the other. My feeling is that the question of vectors is a central question for cultural transfer research, and the semantic question is a very important one. I think it's interesting in our time to deconstruct the forms of identity. And I think cultural transfer research can do that perhaps not better, but as a complement to the comparativism. And many colleagues told me we need not deconstruction of national identity anymore, because national identity was a thing of 19th century. But I wonder how it's possible to defend such a point of view. I think we are in a world context where we feel that it's necessary to go on in this way.
Thank you very much. So we are working almost for 2 hours. Probably we can stop here. If there are any more questions, or very short, please, very short remark.
Sorry, I was late, but last words very interesting for me, and I would like to know much about your dialogue with post-colonial historiography, which actually placed criticism on national identity, on the concept of cultural translation, which seems to me very close to your concept of transfer.
Colonial historiography. What do you understand with colonial historiography?
I mean, post-colonial.
Post-colonial historiography.
With the concept of cultural translation.
Post-colonial historiography is very important for us, because it's a sort of challenge for us, post-colonial historiography. I think in the core of post-colonial historiography, we have the question of power. And there is a distinction between the relations in Europe and the relations between Europe and colonized people, colonized countries. Because colonial countries are under the control of military and under the power of the colony. But I think it's a sort of I think it's possible to understand the colonial context as a field of cultural transfer and of re-semantisation of concepts between the colonies and Europe. I feel the post-colonial ideology as a sort of continuation of the power of the Western countries in front of the colonies. You know, post-colonial studies developed in North American universities or in European universities and they are represented by scholars coming from India, speaking English, and they use the deconstructive philosophy of Derrida and of French philosophers, but it's a sort of construction of North American universities, and I think cultural transfer could be a better tool to speak with African scholars, though they are not all convinced of this possibility.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.